Hi, I'm the history guy. I have a degree in history. I love history. If you love history too, this is the channel for you. In 1885, rebels in the Egyptian province of the Sudan overran the capital of Khartoum and killed the general leading the Sudanese troops there, the British General George Gordon. That raised concerns for the southernmost province of Egypt, Equatoria, and its governor, Emin Pasha. Fearing another Gordon incident, philanthropists in London raised money and engaged the services of famed explorer Henry Morton Stanley to send him on one of the last great 19th century expeditions to the interior of Africa. And so today we join Henry Morton Stanley to deepest, darkest Africa on the 1886 Emin Pasha Relief Expedition. Henry Morton Stanley was one of the most famous explorers of his time. A Welshman who immigrated to America at the age of 18, he managed to fight on both sides of the U.S. Civil War. Following the war, he became a journalist, chronicling the expansion to the American West and then visiting the Ottoman Empire. As a correspondent for the New York Herald, he accompanied the British expedition against Emperor Tewodros II in Ethiopia in 1868, and then covered the Glorious Revolution in Spain. But he became most famous worldwide when he chronicled his 700-mile expedition to locate famed missionary Dr. David Livingstone, who had been missing in Africa for over 2 years, famously uttering the words, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume?" After several more years exploring in the Congo, he was engaged by a group of British businessmen to mount an expedition to relieve the governor of Equatoria, Emin Pasha. Emin Pasha was a Polish-born, German-trained medical doctor and naturalist. He'd spent several years working for the government in the Ottoman Empire and had been given the honorary title Pasha. In 1878, the Khedive of Egypt had made him governor of the province of Equatoria, even though he wasn't getting enough resources to really help develop the province. After the fall of Khartoum in 1885, the rebels started moving south, and Pasha only had a few thousand troops, not enough to defend himself. His cries for help to Europe received considerable sympathy, especially following the death of George Gordon at Khartoum. Equatoria was established in 1870 as an idealistic effort to create a model state in the interior of Africa. But because it was so remote, it never really developed and was only the province of a few adventurers and explorers. It included territory along the White Nile in the present-day states of the South Sudan and Uganda. There were over 400 applications to join the expedition. Stanley chose a handful of officers who had good experience in Africa. He chose a route up the Congo River rather than the shorter overland route, arguing that river travel was easier and gave less opportunity for desertion. Stanley preferred that it was privately funded, not a government mission. He said, "The expedition is non-military. That is to say, its purpose is not to fight, destroy, or waste. Its purpose is to save, to relieve distress, to carry comfort." The term darkest Africa refers to the part of Africa where the jungle is so dense that light scarcely reaches the ground. The expedition faced the typical challenges: disease, poor supply, hostile natives. Stanley was compelled to leave a part of the group in camp, a rear column commanded by 5 of his European officers, that was supposed to move up when more porters arrived to carry supply. When Stanley finally caught up with Emin Pasha, at first Emin Pasha didn't want to leave, he just wanted supply, but eventually the revolution would force his hand and he would have to come south. Stanley returned to the rear column, which he hadn't heard from in months, to find out that the news was grim. He'd left behind 5 officers and several hundred troops and porters. Now of the 5 officers, 1 was dead, shot by his own troops, 1 was in camp dying of a fever, another had been sent home too ill to continue, and 1 more had gone to the coast to try to telegraph for instructions since they hadn't heard from Stanley in over a year. Of those 5 officers, only 1 remained to command the column, and the vast majority of the expedition had either deserted or died. Stanley finally managed to collect up Emin Pasha and his few surviving supporters, but then they had to travel again back to the coast down the same hard route. Disease, starvation, unfriendly natives. By the time that they got back to safety at the coast in Zanzibar, not 1 in 3 who had left on the original expedition made it to the end. To make matters worse, when they finally did get safely to the coast and to the palace of the Sultan of Zanzibar, the Sultan threw a party for them, and Emin Pasha got so drunk that he fell out a second-story window. He survived, but he was unable to travel with Stanley back to England. Stanley returned back to London, and initially there was great acclaim. After all, he had achieved his purpose of rescuing Emin Pasha. But the reputation turned dark as details of the expedition came out, especially what had happened in the rear camp. It turns out there were serious allegations that the Europeans there had abused not just the natives, but their own soldiers and porters. The European that was shot by a soldier because he was beating that soldier's wife. And in the most shocking allegation, one of the other officers became so fascinated with cannibalism that he was accused of purchasing a native slave girl and selling her to cannibals so that he could watch the process. As accusations flew back and forth between Stanley and the families of the officers who had died, Stanley's reputation was destroyed. By 1899, the British Army had reconquered the Sudan and Equatoria. Stanley's reputation never recovered from the accusations that came from the Emin Pasha Relief Expedition. While it had technically been a success, the cost was very high, especially to reputation. And because of that, this was the last expedition of its kind. From then on, expeditions to the interior would either be purely military, for military purpose, or purely scientific. But what was most shocking is what happened with the English gentlemen who were left behind in the rear camp, as once again we find out that the Europeans who came to tame savage Africa were themselves the savages. Years later, when he was reminiscing, Henry Morton Stanley offered some insight into what had happened to the men back at camp. He wrote, "Deprived of butcher's meat and bread and wine, books, newspapers, the society and influence of their friends, fever seized them, wrecked minds and bodies. Good nature was banished by anxiety, until they became but shadows, morally and physically, of what they had been in English society." The term darkest Africa is supposed to refer to that part of Africa where the jungle is so thick that the light does not reach the ground. But maybe there's a double meaning. Maybe the darkness isn't just the jungle, but the darkness is here, just waiting to come out. I'm the History Guy. I hope you enjoyed this edition of my series, 5 Minutes of History, short snippets of forgotten history, 5 to 10 minutes long. If you enjoyed these 5 minutes and you'd like 5 minutes more, then please click like and subscribe.